So those of you that were here last year will already be acquainted with Nneka. We had her on a panel discussing venture capital's role within climate change, and she was so incredible we decided to bring her back to do more of a one-on-one conversation focused on climate equity. So Nneka, you are the principal at Aligned Climate Capital, where you invest in energy, sustainable land use, clean transportation, and resilient and efficient infrastructure startups. Could you describe or discuss the role of finance in promoting climate equity?
Sure. And before we start, I'd like to just bring us on the same page around climate equity. I think people use the term very broadly, and it also covers a lot of things. When I think about climate equity, I'm thinking about deploying solutions that support kind of the main pillars of climate justice. That looks like resilient and adaptive communities, environmental justice, just transition, engaging and educating communities, upholding indigenous practices, things like that. So a lot of times, when we use these words, they're big umbrella terms, and it's almost like, what does that even mean? And I also come to this with a perspective that this whole climate ecosystem is a very holistic body. The things that we do as a people and a planet are interconnected, but today I'm investing in companies that are based in the United States, in Canada, and that's where I spent most of my life. So I'm coming from this from a very Amero-centric perspective. So I apologize if there are other ways that, in advance, if this doesn't fit a global perspective as other people know it. I think climate equity is really interesting, and also a place where people have been thinking about really the government and philanthropic organizations really taking the lead. But there's a lot of opportunity for large commercial industries and finance to really take a lead, because the climate crisis is too important for us to be slow about it. And we're already behind on where we need to be in terms of making sure that the earth is a hospitable place for us to live. And the three ways I think about how finance, in particular private finance, where I spend my time investing, is really around access, structure, and success. Okay. So there's a famous quote that says, if you want something that you've never had, you have to do something you've never done. And for us, what we haven't had before is a sustainable green economy that's equitable. So what does it look like to create that? Two big ways is really around the access to capital and then access to people, for people to participate in this ecosystem. So right now we've heard a lot about the IRA and the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, but outside of those governmental opportunities and those non-dilutive funding, there's also ways for us as financial investors to look at ways we can stack different types of capital. We've been seeing a lot of conversations about first-of-a-kind projects, but even for folks that are receiving non-dilutive funding to do projects, they still need funding for working capital to pay the bills and to do overhead. And we've, at Align, we're spending a lot of time with companies to help them, navigate that experience, to say, like, great, I have all this money to do community solar, but what does that look like to build an organization that can support that level of growth? The other way is like bringing people under the umbrella. Historically, I think when people think about climate tech and clean energy or resilience, you're thinking about PhDs and engineers and people who've spent a lot of time reading about systems. But reality is that there's space for everyone in the climate transition, and we can't actually get this done without a high level of collaboration. One of the portfolio company CEOs that we've invested in, Devin Hampton, he's a CEO of Utility API, was really frustrated by this because when he started his company, he was not yet a college graduate, and he felt a little bit offended by the way that people talk about who gets to participate in climate tech. And a few years ago, he started this program called EDICT, which stands for Empowering Diversity in Climate Technology. And it starts at the internship level, giving people from all sorts of backgrounds, in particular people coming from underserved backgrounds, diverse students, people who haven't gone to college, who have skill sets that can be useful across the climate industry. And they've had hundreds of interns come through that process. As a way to think about like what the next generation of people who work in climate tech look like. The second part I talked about is structure. So for those of us who are investing in companies and we're leading these deals, we have a lot of power as it relates to term sheets and board seats. And with that structure, we think about what does it take for this organization? We have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that this company is optimizing, its success and its growth. But we also have power to decide what it means to optimize. So it's very short-sighted for us to think about optimizing near-term returns, cash returns, in exchange for the life of our planet. And that's part of the reason why we're here today, because we've kind of had unchecked growth without always being aware of what the implications would be downstream. So for some of our portfolio companies, or for all of our portfolio companies, when we look at our term sheets, we're always talking about what do sustainability metrics look like, what does employee safety look like, not just GHG emissions or electricity use, like what type of workforce are you creating and what types of jobs are you creating, who are the folks that will be affected by this technology downstream. And furthermore, you do have some power to help suggest the direction of the company. One of our portfolio companies is a company called Box Power. They're dedicated to building remote microgrids and have really focused on areas that are most affected by climate change. So that could be parts of California that are high risk for wildfire, remote areas in Alaska, indigenous lands that haven't been fully connected by the distribution grid. And we are funding them to scale in those areas because we know that everyone needs to be, we can't just leave some parts of this country or some parts of this world behind and only electrify our cities. And that was a specific decision by the company in the terms of how they were growing and from the funders to decide that this is what we want to invest in. There's lots of other microgrid companies that are doing interesting stuff, but that's not their focus. The last piece I think I want to talk about is successes. I think the stereotype of finance is the monopoly man with the big money bags, hoarding, Scrooge McDuck. But I think there's also an opportunity for us that when we have success, we share it. I mean, I think there is also a big conversation that needs to be had about who gets to feel the success of a good climate transition. Within our organization, we made a specific decision that, when our investments do well, like the communities that support us should do well as well. We've dedicated a portion of our carry, that means the returns on our investments, to 3 organizations. One of them is the Climate Equity Action Fund, which is dedicated to funding catalytic funding, capacity building, and technical assistance for projects and civic engagement in diverse communities. Another is the Honnold Foundation, which is expanding access to equitable access to solar. And the third is Impact Capital Managers, which is a membership organization for folks who are investing in impact so that they can scale not just returns, but that impact. And we think that it's important for us to kind of lift as we climb so that other financial institutions can take these same steps and optimize the way that they work with communities and think about climate as well.
Phenomenal. So I just want to let everyone know that we're going to have time for questions. So if there's anything that you're thinking of, please hold on to it. Nneka, on top of being the principal at Align Climate Capital, you're also the founder of Green Tech Noir, which is a digital platform that you've designed to connect Black and brown people globally who are working in the businesses of sustainability and climate tech, from founders, investors to leaders, and more. How has your work with Green Tech Noir shaped your advocacy for specific funding models to ensure the acceleration of climate equity?
Yeah. So one thing that I will always remember was being in grad school. I did my master's in finance with the energy specialization at Tulane in Louisiana. And I went to my first big energy conference in New Orleans, and I was the only Black woman there. That was shocking to me. New Orleans is a very diverse city. The energy industry as a whole is relatively, can be diverse compared to other tech industries. But there's so few women, and definitely not a lot of Black people in finance specifically. I thought that was just a fluke. Years go by, and I continue to be in rooms where I don't see a lot of people that look like me. And when you're junior and you're just trying to scrap and make it, you just focus internally on how do I get to the next level? And once you get to a certain level, you look back and you're like, oh my gosh, why haven't things gotten better? So, sometimes you got to take things into your own hands. Started it particularly when many of us were sequestering at home and we don't have the physical experience of being at conferences and happy hours. And I realized how many deals and how many kind of unwritten opportunities that were not written and weren't documented that people were missing out on. So I made sure to create a network so that people knew like what were the job opportunities, what were the funding opportunities, some that were posted, some that were unposted. But also when you feel like you are one in a bigger crowd, you have the stress of sometimes representing an entire group, so the fear of tokenism. We wanted a space where people can grow and ask questions safely and be able to take their career to the next level without the exposure of people judging them or their entire group just for that particular experience. So Green Tech Noir was born. Last I checked, we have over 300 participants who are sharing on a daily basis all sorts of opportunities. I'm so excited. I should have been keeping track from the very beginning how many people have gotten jobs just through the network. People who never thought of themselves as a potential venture capital investor going from an operator role to VC just through the network. It's been great.
Phenomenal. So of the investing models that you've worked with in Green Tech Noir, what impact have you seen with them in the climate space for diversity? Have you seen increase with climate VCs or climate startups of diverse background from the get-go, or is it just creating a pipeline for people of diverse backgrounds into more of a climate tech space?
Yeah, so I think it's a mixture of two things. One, people often talk about a pipeline issue or saying like, I would love to hire someone with a certain background and I just don't know them. That's a relatively easy thing to fix once you're connected to the right networks, you connect two and two. But the second thing that I think we as a culture is kind of dealing with is understanding like what does the right candidate for a role look like? What does the right founder for a solution look like? And we all have our own biases that came from the ways that we have experienced the world or from our educational opportunities. And that's just something that's going to take a lot longer. When it comes down to like what I've seen be really successful as it relates to diversity is like we've seen a lot of accelerator programs and incubator programs be incredibly successful with bringing founders from all different backgrounds, usually because they're being judged on a very objective scale. Oftentimes, other sorts of investment structures, you're doing a lot of warm intros, so you're heavily biased by who your network is. But if you're doing an open call for applications, you're now seeing a lot of companies side by side. And another thing is that the low cost of entry to participate in accelerators as well. What's great, therefore, after the accelerators, big accelerators like Elemental Accelerator, Third Derivative, Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, are now really creating a great pipeline of deal flow for early stage investors who come afterwards. So I'm a huge proponent of the work that they do.
Amazing. So one last question before we open it up to the room. What is your long-term vision for the future of climate equity? How would you like to see Green Tech Noir play a part in that?
Yeah. So my long-term vision for climate equity is for us to think about the decisions that we make in investing the same way that we think about our own personal decisions in our lives. I think when people are buying a car or buying a house, you think about things like your neighborhood, what are the schools around here? How much sunlight does this house get? But oftentimes when we think about finance or we think about things really black and white, like what is my return profile? What's the absolute value of this investment? What is my time frame? And those are great when you're talking about things that have less information asymmetry. But we also have to think about like what is the network of the founder? What information am I getting access to that I didn't have before from the folks I've invested in before? What personality traits does this person have that can unlock new traits through connections with the other founders in our portfolio? You might think about it like, what new thing do I not know that I'll take away from this experience, and think about portfolio diversity rather than thinking about each investment on its own. And we do it all the time financially. We're just adding a couple more attributes for us to do that diversification. The hard part is that it's hard. It takes time, and it's not going to be easy. And I want people to give themselves grace. I want people to say, like, this is something I'm going to do, and take the necessary steps to educate themselves on each step of the way, and find people who are committed to that journey to join them.
Great. Questions? Do we have any? Let me. Do I see? Yes.
Thank you. This is wonderful to actually learn about you and what you've been up to. You were starting to say also at the beginning some things around, well, I'll just use my words for it because I don't remember your words for it, but that included like indigenous ways of like relating and connecting and bringing those values into your investments and to how you're sort of forming what you are. And I'd just love if you could just speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, so I think for a long time, there was, and this is, I'm speaking for myself, I believe deeply about the holistic connection between people and nature. And sometimes we forget that science is a reflection of the earth technology or nature's technology as well. So sometimes we might say, like, let's do nitrogen fertilization for land, and we'll, go to the lab and come up with some very cool chemicals and sprinkle it all over the farmland, only to discover that there's indigenous practices that do that naturally, that require like our emissionless or less emissions, and already are part of practices that have been done for hundreds of years, but we've disregarded them because we have disenfranchised indigenous folks across the world. More recently, I heard a news article this morning on my drive here about like the Yunok tribe taking over wildland restoration and reforestation. It's a little bit different from some of the drone technologies that are doing it, but it's just proving that there are other ways for us to look at nature-based solutions that don't necessarily include a robot.
We have time for one. Yes, right back there.
Thanks, Nneka. That was awesome. When I hear things like this, I'm always like, oh my God, this is amazing. Of course, we should be thinking this way. But then I'm going to fly home. I work from home. I personally try not to consume too much media just for like anxiety reasons. But how can investors, and maybe you can talk about your personal practices, but like how can investors get the exposure to different types of people and communities so that it can aid their holistic investment thinking?
Ooh, that's such a great question. So as I mentioned, Aligned is part of Impact Capital Managers. So within, I'll just pub it, Impact Capital Managers brings people who are investing across the impact ecosystem. So if I go to a convening, we're talking to people who are investing in education and healthcare, climate, people who are investing as, deep as microbes, and other folks who are investing as large as real estate buildings. So I think it's really important, and I think this a good trait for a human to have is just really surrounding yourself with people who are doing different stuff and have different mindsets. I think that's just structurally, there's organizations like that all around. That's just one of them. I think the other way is just really staying on top of good media, because we can't be everywhere all at once, but we can read a lot about people's lifestyles and stories and successes. I understand about social media being really stressful, but really curating that experience. There's really great work from Axios and Canary Media and The Grist, and some other kind of organizations put out some really great information, but it requires a lot of intention for investors and individuals to kind of find those communities and get connected to those stories.
Phenomenal. Well, thank you so much, Nneka.